I'm Alexandra Kreis, and you're listening to Outer Travel in a Journey. Journeying now for 30 years into the life and practice of yoga, I have met many who have taken interesting turns, went past extraordinary bumps, and reached unexpected places. People with whom I shared conversations about everyday struggles, intimate realizations, larger questions, ideas, and dreams. So today, I'm passing on the mic to one of them so we could hear and celebrate the wisdom in people's differences and experiences.
When I had this accident, this head injury, I was advised by somebody, why don't you start exploring trauma? And I said, well, I just have a head injury. I just need to go to neurologist and do my Ayurveda stuff and all that. And she said, well, I had a head injury in an accident a while ago, and I wish I knew what I know now. And just start exploring trauma, because it's big, when something happens like that and maybe you lose consciousness and somehow your nervous system, and that's what happened to me, believes you're dead even though you're not, and you can get stuck into that trauma. So the whole of the body just goes in shutdown. So it's not just the symptoms that you would have because you bang your head or something like that. It's more profound, and you can even have symptoms like you can go into depression and being all coming from this. So it's a big trauma. So I started working on the traumatic part of having fallen and with all what happened. And that was like a huge portal, because through this trauma, all the other traumas in the past found their way to become conscious and realize, wow, there's so much I need to work on. And that brought me to this idea that when we think of trauma, we think of really bad things happening to somebody, like being in a war or something really huge,
Abused or
attacked, and that happens, and that's huge. That is huge. However, trauma is much deeper than that, to the point that I think if you are a human and you're alive and you reach certain age, sooner or later we're going to be suffering from some trauma, something that's going to completely change the way you see things, and maybe not in a positive way at the start unless you work through it. And it's very there's a big stigma about being, it's traumatized, or it's the big stigma, when I think that many people should be looking inside and working through.
Yeah, that's why I'm so happy that it's come to the acknowledgement in society. I understood through my conversation with Adair Finucane lately on this podcast that trauma is, we can all have the same experience. Let's say our parents get divorced, and for some of us, it's just a stepping stone into our own strength and seeing our own skills. And for some others, it is, the onset of trauma, which kind of keeps repeating itself in behavioral pattern, in psychological pattern, in self-neglect, and so on and so forth, right? Yeah, so not any experience you can have can lead to a loop in you, and the more you ignore it, that's how I understand it. The more you ignore it, the more it gets fed. Funny enough, is that right? I mean, you're doing research on it, so
yes, and also many people, at least my generation, getting and we've been brought up in a way where trauma is not acknowledged, and you have to be strong, and you have to chin up and keep going. And if you see yourself as traumatized, or if there's trauma in your life, it's that you're weak. There's something wrong with you. As you say, oh, look, this person has gone through all this and this person is okay, and look at you with this that happened and you are a mess. And there is a big stigma about that, and that's why many people, even now that trauma is becoming more and more visible, even now it's very difficult to take that
now you can hear Breaking Free from Trauma with Adair Finucane.
What I experienced as a kid and throughout my young adult life doesn't actually count as trauma because, well, assuming that only trauma could cause PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So there's this contingency factor. There's certain things that, quote, count, and there's certain things that don't, which in one sense, who gives a fuck? And in the other sense, like who, yeah, whatever. And in the other sense, it actually matters because of how systems work and what's reimbursed and what's validated and what isn't, you know? So there's plenty of reasons why people want to keep certain boundaries constrained, or else we'll have people saying that, oh, you made me go to school, it's traumatic, right? You know, there's that they call it bracket creep. However, the woman I work with, Mickey Spurlick, my amazing mentor, the midwife turned social work researcher, she got into studying trauma nuts and bolts because she discovered that emotional abuse and neglect, neither of those count as precursors to PTSD. It doesn't, quote, count. So it's very interesting. It's taken me years to recognize that my experience counts as trauma, because if you look at all the tools that social workers typically use or psychologists typically use to denote what people have been through in order to treat them, I don't have almost any of the ACEs. They're called adverse childhood experiences. Those are specific list of things that can lead to negative health outcomes for adults. My folks were together, we had enough to eat, I lived in a safe place, I lived in a loving family, loving extended family, had good friends, right? My life looked so normal.
Yeah.
In the supportive sense. And yet, I really went through a lot, and it's only been really when you facilitated a call that I did for the yoga health coaching program not long ago, and even sharing my story there, I had another layer of stepping into truth around, oh, this is so real. And even now I feel it again, like it's very affirming just to be able to say, oh, that's real. And to be witnessed and realize, oh, none of these people think I'm just some complaining, middle-class white girl, right? That's not the appearance, but isn't that interesting that might be something that's my, the old inner dialogue. There's nothing wrong. You're fine. Get over it. Not that I want to keep that thought, but those are things that will come up. And I have to chop their heads off.
Yeah, and it's what lies in between the lines. I mean, when I did social work way back in the days, and I was just helping young people to build their last step into independency, because they weren't allowed to live by themselves. So they lived in this, like apartment together, shared apartment. And what I didn't realize for a very long time, how difficult that work was, because there was no specific thing happening with these people, but they were all deeply traumatized. They came from backgrounds where they didn't tell the stories fully because they didn't think it was something special. And suddenly stuff would kind of happen. Like my favorite story is about like this guy coming into my apartment, or coming into the apartment with a gun, and thinking that it's like, I need to have that folder of you and need to know what's written about my girlfriend here. And I'm like, what's going on? And so shocking to be in these situations. And I hear you saying that. So I'm super curious how you, almost like unveiled this word for you and this process for you. So what was it really that opened you up to say, like, yes, this still, even if it's, not classically defined as trauma, what has you made become clear? That's interesting.
You know what it was? It was my teacher, Kia. I started doing advanced training with her last 2 years ago, maybe, I think I went. And we were doing shadow work. And she asked all of us, we were just diving into our stuff, right? As people do at yoga teacher trainings and that kind of space. And she asked us to share with the group of about 16 to 17 people a statement that was true about ourselves. After we'd done all this processing and spending time, and the thing I said, which is so powerful, and I'm still working with it, is there is nothing wrong with me. And the release that came from that, and of course, being in a space that's so unbelievably sacred and supportive was amazing, because I had a very, very strong emotional reaction. I mean, when I have a big reaction, I'll blow the roof off a place. So for me to feel safe enough to do that is such a gift. So I had these people holding the space for me, and Kia, I was really just losing it in the best way, like in the way that a lot of us who love to process our stuff and love to heal. It's like, oh yes, I get to like scream and cry and lose it, have a physiological freak out release. Yeah. She came over to me, and she may have put her hand on my back or something, and I think I said something like, this isn't how, like something along the lines of denying myself, saying that this is trauma. I think I said something like, this isn't trauma, how could it be? And she's like, this is trauma. And here I am, trauma researcher, I ought to know, right? And I couldn't even honor my own stuff, and she just put her hand there and said, yes, it is.
Following up with Patrick Harahy, Innate Resources for Healing
What kind
Trauma.
of trauma do you encounter? I mean, a lot of us, I had two people on this show already talking about trauma, but I would love to hear, what is your main experience? What kind of trauma are you facing in your work?
Okay, I would divide trauma into two different categories. There's a developmental trauma that I think everybody experiences in some ways growing up in families. It can be due to social issues, alcohol issues, separations, divorce, domestic violence, all that sort of stuff. And then the other type then is shock trauma. It can be sexual abuse, traffic accidents, work accidents. I've been working with somebody just today now, and with a serious accident on a building site, and all that sort of stuff. And so there's a different ways of working with both. I probably won't go into it too deeply here, but of course. With developmental trauma, people develop, say, putting in a nutshell, belief systems, that and with trauma, a lot of parts are put into the unconscious. With trauma, if there's, say, something going on in the family, maybe people use avoidance techniques. That's just one thing. And that's when people are then adults, then they're using the same techniques, in relationships. They're avoiding conflict, they're avoiding, and that's...
Are these people aware of that they go into trauma? Because I often think and sense that we do not really tap into developmental trauma a lot for ourselves until maybe a relationship breaks, as you say, or maybe we can't hold a job because of insomnia or whatever. What is your experience? How do people come to you?
That can be the situation as well. Very often, like somebody, I've had a few people say, for instance, they've had pains, maybe, different pains in their body. They've gone down the medical road, and they find absolutely nothing. So it turns out it's a somatic thing, very often, when people become parents, maybe their child reaches 3 or 4, that's the time maybe they had a trauma, when they were small. So that actually activates their own trauma, There's a whole lot of different things. I've worked with people, say, for instance, who know one particular person who had a very successful career, and after about 20 years, he couldn't travel, couldn't get into a plane anymore, couldn't get into a lift, couldn't. So it was all the trauma sort of re-emerged, So
It can kind of hit out of the blue, isn't it? Like that, it can be triggered by something, and then
it can be triggered because, yes, our bodies have a way of sort of hiding the trauma, or sort of, that's a protecting. No, we have protectors that protect us from the trauma, and then all of a sudden it can erupt. You know.
I see that often in my practice as a consultant. You know, that people come with pains or things, and they often, when we go through the health history, and because as such, like you, we're working also with the mental aspects of healing. It's not like how your skin looks, how your poses, how your eyes shine, your skin shines, but we're looking also at the relationship between things that happen. And what I hear most often is that people feel like, but I could do this, you know, I could do this before. I didn't have these issues before. And I often kind of relate this to really coming to a point, a high point in their life. And we might not call it trauma, but to a juncture where the body says, like, I don't want to do this anymore. You have to face it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I'm sure another thing, since you're into yoga, and I'm sure you've heard of iRest yoga. Yeah. And Richard Miller. Have you heard of Richard Miller? I think he was the person who developed. So that is as you probably know, a lot of people who have trauma, when they do yoga relaxation exercises, it can actually bring them back into the trauma again. So we have to be very, very careful. And as I know, as a yoga teacher, I have a few friends now who are yoga teachers, or I have clients actually who went to yoga and got traumatized because the yoga teacher wasn't trauma informed, you know. So it's very important that
yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because I also have other teachers in my circle of teachers that were saying how important it is not to push everybody into meditation, and because it can reactivate trauma. You know, that was one thing that came out quite early, 10 years ago. And, you know, everybody is so, oh yeah, it's so nice to relax in yoga, and it's Shavasana, I like it, but very little do we know about where people
Coming
come
to
from.
yourself after severe trauma with Aisha Arley.
Yeah, and you know, as you say that, there's a really important distinction that took me a long time to figure out, and I want to share this for anybody that needs to hear this. And that is that for a long time, you know, I was in this mentally, emotionally abusive relationship for 10 years. And I was afraid to leave because I was afraid to be alone. And then as soon as I got out of that marriage, I was like looking. And what I realized is there was this anxiety that was driving me, and that I thought that my peace existed outside of myself. My peace existed in some other man or some other relationship to distract myself. But, you know, as much as I resisted it, everything got stripped away. And there I was, standing naked, alone, with nobody but myself. And ultimately, it was the biggest gift, because within that process of being alone and really meeting my anxiety, like face to face, and realizing that the anxiety wasn't driven by anybody else, and it wasn't going to be taken away by anybody else, but that it was me finding the happiness and the peace and the contentment within myself. Like really having this moment where I knew my happiness needs to be with, and my happiness needs to be without, and I need to stop thinking, you know, because I've done a lot of healing around the fact that, you know, my ex-husband was an addict, and it was so easy to blame and play victim. But what I needed to take ownership, I stayed in that relationship for 10 years, and I have to take responsibility for that. I didn't my self-worth, my worthiness, like it was in a place where I wanted more, but I guess deep down I didn't think I deserved more. I didn't have good boundaries, right, to take back my space. And so it was when I came to that place of peace with myself, and, you know, I was still raw, I was still figuring it out, but there was this moment where I said, I have to put myself first. Like, I have to work on my boundaries. I have to, as Larry said, take my power back about who I am. And it was that moment was like the moment my life changed. And then these other pieces came in to support the healing. Does that make sense? But there was that distinctive moment that happened on my own, in my own pain, in my own darkness, and just kind of like, okay. And again, it's not that I even knew that in that moment, but when I look back in time, I realize that moment happened. And that's actually when my relationship with Larry changed, and everything started to kind of grow out of that space. It was like that seed was planted, and then everything began to flourish from that.
If you enjoy listening to my podcast, please consider to become a patron at patreon.com/Alexandra Kreis and pledge your donation.